Good afternoon, and welcome to today's installment of the January Series 2020. My name is Valeria Martinez Castro. I am a senior from Tegucigalpa, Honduras, studying computer science. Will you please take a moment to silence your cell phones? As you're doing so, I would like to welcome guests at all our 60 remote viewing locations, including Midland, Michigan, Brookfield, Wisconsin, Burnaby, British Columbia, and Ludington, Michigan. We're so grateful that you're viewing with us today. And now, will you please join me as we open with a word of prayer? Father, thank you for today and for the privilege of being gathered together to learn more about immigration and belonging. I pray that as we hear Karen speak today, our vision will be widened beyond our small world. Please bless us with insight and empathy so that we will be able to better love and elevate the dignity of our neighbors. In Jesus' name, amen. And now, Sarah Visser, Vice President for Student Life, will introduce our guest.
Within the United States, immigration has become a polarizing economic, political, and social issue. And as you anticipate today's presentation, you may be wondering why we'd choose to walk toward a topic that so many see as divisive. At Calvin, our Reformed Christian mission compels us toward conversations that invite us into deeper understanding of God and His world and a deeper love of our neighbor. Beyond the politics and rhetoric, immigration is a biblical issue because it deals with human beings, image bearers. Our speaker today, Karen Gonzalez, is an immigrant from Guatemala, now living in Baltimore, Maryland. A former public school teacher, she studied theology and missiology at Fuller Theological Seminary in Southern California. And for the last 10 years, she has worked extensively in the nonprofit world. She currently serves immigrants and refugees through her work as Director of Human Resources for World Relief. This past May, Karen released a book entitled The God Who Sees: Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong. In the book, Karen explores the questions that many Christians are asking. What does the Bible say about immigration? How do we hold in tension the command to obey the law and the care of our immigrant neighbors? The stories of Scripture, the stories of her advocacy, and the stories of her family weave together in the book, speaking to each other to reveal the compassionate nature of a God who sees, cares, and acts for those so often pushed to the margins. With gentleness and clarity, Karen invites us today to rediscover the God who is obsessed with the immigrant. Following today's presentation, copies of Karen's book will be available in the West Lobby of the Covenant Fine Arts Center, and she'll be available to greet the audience there. Calvin University is grateful to Howard Miller for underwriting today's presentation. Now please join me in welcoming Karen Gonzalez.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. It's great to be here with you all. Usually when I speak, people ask me, where do you find hope when it comes to immigration? And I find hope in all of you, and all of you who are remote viewing, listening, that you're here and that you want to learn, that you want to know a little bit more about this topic. You embody hope for me. So thank you. So I am from Guatemala, as you heard, and in my culture, we believe that you die 3 times. The first time you die is when you take your last breath. The second time you die is when you're buried in the ground. And the third time that you die is when there is no one left who remembers you. Remembrance. Remembrance is a big part, not just of my culture, but of God's journey with God's people. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Remember God's goodness to you. Remembrance often adds this fuel that we need for our faith when we remember God's past faithfulness. So today I want to talk to you about a woman, a biblical woman, and I want you to remember her in a way that you've perhaps never heard her presented. And that woman is Ruth, the biblical Ruth. People are often surprised to find that there are very famous words spoken by Ruth, and often they're read at weddings. And they are these words: wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you stay, I will stay. And your people will be my people. And your God will be my God. Now, I want you to imagine that those words are not about a wedding, because in fact, in the story, they're not. Imagine that there are words about migration. There are words about one woman's commitment to another woman who is her friend, about integrating into her community when she migrates. That is, in fact, what those words are about. So I want to tell you about this woman. The story of Ruth begins in Bethlehem. The word Bethlehem means house of bread, but ironically, there is no bread left in the house. There is a famine. And when famine comes, people often migrate, not just in the Bible, but even today. So Naomi immigrates with her husband Elimelech, and they find food and sustenance in a Gentile country called Moab. And life is good for a while, but then Elimelech dies. It's really terrible. But things brighten up a tiny bit because Naomi, who has 2 sons, marry local Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And life goes on as before for another 10 years. But then disaster strikes again, and the 2 sons also die. And they leave behind no heirs, no children. 3 widows. Now, in our context, 3 widows might be a really hard situation, but in the ancient world, the simple fact of the matter is that 3 women without husbands and without sons were incredibly vulnerable. Vulnerable to poverty, to exploitation, to death. It was a very precarious situation that these women were left in. But good news reaches Naomi. She finds out that there is food once again in Bethlehem. The famine is over. And in fact, it's harvest time right now, an ideal time to return. So she decides to do so. She decides to go home again, right? The dream of every immigrant, to return home. She starts out on the journey and she invites both her daughters-in-law to come with her. And so they set off on the journey. And for reasons we don't know, suddenly Naomi changes her mind and she decides her daughters-in-law shouldn't go. I don't know why she does that, but she says, no, you should stay in your own country. Stay behind. Even though we don't know, I like to speculate as to why she might have asked them to stay behind. Perhaps she knew what it was like to be an immigrant, and she wanted to spare them the hardships of that life. Perhaps because they have no sons, she's now recognizing that they are just going to be 2 more people that she's going to have to take care of in her homeland. Or maybe it's because she remembers that Moabites are despised people back in Bethlehem, and she wants to spare them what may happen. The scriptures say that Ammonites and Moabites can't belong to the Lord's assembly, not even the 10th generation of such people. There was so much strife between Moab and Judah. Moabites are part of Abraham's extended family and they're descended from the incestuous union between Lot and his daughters. So Israel's hatred for their Moabite cousins was long-standing. It had a very long history. In fact, they were forbidden from marrying Moabite women. I don't know what motivated Naomi, but she manages to convince one of her daughters-in-law to stay. Orpah, it seems, is a sensible person, And she seems to see the truth of what Naomi is saying, that probably her best shot at remarriage and survival is staying behind in her own land of Moab. And so she returns home. But Ruth is somewhat irrational. She tells Naomi, I'm staying with you no matter what. She speaks those famous words of love and loyalty, and she commits to staying with Naomi no matter what. And so she does. So the two women trudge into Bethlehem together. I like to imagine what it must have been like. Things hadn't been good the day that Naomi had left for Moab, but at least she'd had her husband and she'd had her young sons. And now she's coming back. She's 10 years older, and she has nothing. Nothing except an equally sad-looking widow that she now has to take care of in her hometown. But of course, the good news is they will have some sustenance because there's provision for God's people within God's law for people who are exactly like them. The scriptures say, whenever you are reaping the harvest of your field and you leave some grain in the field, don't go back and get it. Let it go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows, so that the Lord God blesses you in all that you do. Similarly, when you beat the olives of your olive trees, don't go back over them twice. Let the leftovers go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows. Again, when you pick the grapes of your vineyard, don't pick them over twice. Let the leftovers go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows. Do you want to know something amazing that is very heartening to me? In the Bible that we all read, there are so many times when God's people disobey God, when God's people do things out of fear or out of anxiety. But in this story, you see God's people trust and obey God and God's word. And it's really beautiful because what you see in this passage right here in Deuteronomy is exactly what happens. In the story of Ruth, this command is carried out. Two penniless widows, one an immigrant from a hated community, arrive in the society of Judah in Bethlehem. And the immigrant Ruth is welcomed unto the field of Boaz, where she gleans where the harvesters have left behind. Boaz seems to know and understand that even this immigrant from a despised community has a right to decent work, to earn a decent living. And he provides protection for Ruth. In our context, immigrants do the work that nobody else wants to do. But in that context, Ruth does hard work because all agricultural work is hard. But it's exactly the kind of work that everybody else was doing in that society. And Ruth is entitled not just to work, but to rest. That whole society observed Sabbath, and she also was invited into Sabbath rest. Boaz allows her not just to work among his own harvesters, but he also provides her security and protection. He says that no one should harass her, that no one should bother her, that no one should assault her. And in fact, he invites her to his table. And she drinks from the cisterns that the rest of the workers are drinking. And remember, she's an unclean foreigner. And she sits at his table and she drinks from the same containers that he drinks from. It's a really, really beautiful picture. What you see in the book of Ruth is incredible. It's a really beautiful picture because you have Boaz, who is an extremely powerful man. He's a landowner, and he uses his power for good. He uses his power to serve the most vulnerable people in his community. And you have Naomi, who isn't wealthy, who is poor, but she's a cultural insider. She's from there. She knows how the laws work. and she teaches Ruth about her culture and how to navigate it. And then you have Ruth. Often when this story is told, it's almost as if Ruth and Naomi are damsels in distress, and the savior on the white horse is Boaz. But this is not a Disney princess story. Not at all. These two women also work for their survival, for their own thriving. And in fact, what you see is that Ruth is a very hard worker. And she's also very socially savvy. She pays attention to what's happening. And she listens to the counsel of her mother-in-law. She's a kind and compassionate person. What happens in this society is that everyone thrives, not just survives. In fact, we know from reading the book of Matthew that Ruth is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. This foreign Moabite woman enters the lineage of Jesus. She becomes the grandmother of King David. It's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. But I want you to consider something. What would happen if Ruth, instead of arriving in Bethlehem, arrived at the US-Mexico border? What would happen to Ruth? This is a great question asked by a rabbi in an essay called Holy Economics. What would happen to Ruth at the US-Mexico border? Would she be allowed entry into our country? I can tell you without a doubt that she wouldn't be. Under our current system, there is no recourse for someone like Ruth. Some people have called Ruth a refugee from Moab, but according to our definition, she's not a refugee. She's an economic immigrant. So she doesn't qualify under refugee status or asylum status. Does she have a relationship where someone could sponsor her? Well, her husband is dead. He could have sponsored her. Her mother-in-law might be able to sponsor her with some good legal representation. However, her mother-in-law is poor. She has to prove that she'd be able to support Ruth for at least the first 10 years. And she has no means to even support herself. Her last hope might be the diversity visa lottery. However, that's for people who have a high school diploma. Given that she's a woman in the ancient world, it's very likely she didn't know how to read and write, and she has no marketable skills. Today, Ruth would be turned away at our border, and Naomi would go on alone back into Bethlehem. That's the reality of our system today. I want to talk to you about some of the complications of migration and our responsibility that we have as Christians in the way that we think about this issue and in the things that we do about it. I don't know if you've ever read the Somali poet Warsan Shire, but this is one of the most powerful quotes from one of her poems. She says, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." Just like Ruth, most immigrants are not dreaming of leaving their countries. We're not sitting in our countries thinking about the American dream, and this seems to be a misunderstanding that people have about migration. When people leave their country, they leave pieces of themselves behind. They leave their home, their comfort, their home language, often extended family or immediate family. Your very sense of self is left behind, and you have to start all over again, almost like a child in a new country. So why do immigrants leave home? These are the primary reasons that people migrate to the US. Number one is to work. Number two is to reunite families. So sometimes maybe dad left years ago and came here to work, and mom and kids were left behind. So now they want to reunite the family. Number three is to flee persecution and violence. And finally, number 4, immigrants are people after all, and sometimes they seek new opportunities and adventure. I want us to look at the terms really carefully because we hear a lot of information and it's good for all of us to know what we're talking about. So an immigrant, any person who leaves their home country and moves permanently to another country. So refugees, a refugee is any person who flees their home country to another country, usually a neighboring country, and then they apply for refugee status in that second country due to persecution for their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Social group could be anything. It could be educated Muslim women in some countries in North Africa and the Middle East, for example. So refugees receive an immigrant visa before they arrive in the US. So in that second country that they fled to, they receive the immigrant visa to come to the US. So let's look at asylee or asylum seeker. People who flee their home country due to war or violence and present themselves at a port of entry to the US and then apply for asylum for the same reasons as a refugee, due to persecution for their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Asylum seekers receive an immigrant visa after they arrive in the US, either at a port of entry or within the first year that they are allowed into the US. Less than 10% of asylum applications are successful. So that was right before the current administration took over. It's down to about 4 to 5% right now. So a little bit about migration in the US. There was a study done by the Immigration Policy Center, and it revealed that immigrants are more likely to become victims of unreported crimes, wage theft and assault being the top 2, domestic violence and sexual assault, human trafficking, mostly labor trafficking, and to experience workforce inequities, underpaid or no paid time off, exploitation at work, and a breakdown in family structures. So ironically, one of the top 2 reasons people come is to reunite families, and yet one of the things that often happens in the families break down here. So a study by Amnesty International, among many other groups, revealed that 70 to 80% of immigrant women crossing the border between the US and Mexico are sexually assaulted. In fact, it's such a crisis that there have even been Catholic groups who distribute birth control to women so that they don't become pregnant from the rapes. The real crisis at the border is this vulnerability of immigrant women and girls. Women and girls experience danger entering the US and poor conditions once they're in the US. So these are all the facts about who these people are and what happens to them in the United States. So let's look at how we got here. How did we arrive at this place? So I want to talk a little bit about immigration history. First immigration law was the Chinese Exclusion Act. It did exactly what it sounds like. It excluded Chinese people. It allowed Chinese men to come and build the railroad, and once they did, they wanted them out. Second is the Congressional Commission report. So this report was really about excluding Southern Europeans and also Jewish immigrants who were believed to be intellectually inferior and unable to assimilate. In fact, it was under this report, it said that Italian immigrants were prone to criminality and were intellectually inferior. Then you have the 1924 Immigration Act, which is the first federal policy. And this policy set quotas according to race. So there were no quotas if you were Northern European, but if you were Southern European or from any other part of the country, there were very, very strict quotas. It was very open that this was racial. It had to do with race and what you looked like. And finally, in 1965, we have the Immigration and Nationality Act. And this is based on family connections and employability skills. So finally, in 1965, we have a law that has nothing to do with race. It has to do with family connections and your employability to enter the US. And that's how long it took to get an immigration law that had no racial component in it. So immigration is an economic issue, it is a social issue, and it's a political issue. But it's also a Christian and a biblical issue because it deals with human beings, and human beings are image bearers of God. Anytime you have an issue that affects humans, it is automatically a biblical issue because of that. And because it's about people who are made in the image of God, you will hear me say, not illegals, not aliens, but undocumented or unauthorized immigrants, right? You might have seen the sign that no human being is illegal. And I think it's important that we watch the language we use when we're talking about human beings. Language does shape reality. It affects the way we think about people and the way that we view them. So in the Bible, God has a very special concern for the immigrant. Ger is the Hebrew word closest to immigrant in English. It appears 92 times in the Old Testament. Usually it appears like this: the same law applies to the native born and to the immigrant living among you. The scriptural witness is that we are to care for the immigrant stranger living among us without any caveat that exempts us from this responsibility, if it's not in our national security or our economic interest. This is a quote from Jenny Yang and Matt Sorensen in their book, Welcoming the Stranger. And in fact, this is true in the scriptures as well. I want you to read the scriptures with new eyes, and I want you to notice how often, particularly in the Old Testament, God tells God's people to treat immigrants well, to love them as neighbors, and to do justice for them. In fact, Job, as he's telling God all the reasons why he has been a good man who has followed God and obeyed God's commandments, one of the things he says is, never did an immigrant come to my door, never did a stranger come to my door, that I did not welcome him and treat him well. Now, often when I talk about this, people will say to me, and rightly so, well, what about other parts of the Bible that talk about things like respecting the law? And I think that's a valid question. There is a passage in Romans 13 that says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God. And those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority, resist what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. I think it is good to talk about this passage and not ignore it. It's absolutely true. It's also true, though, that U.S. laws are not God's immutable laws. They change or are repealed. In fact, we have a whole branch of government, legislative branch, devoted to examining our laws, to adding laws, to changing laws. Think about all the things that used to be legal in our country that no longer are. It used to be illegal to own people as slaves, to deny women the right to vote or own property. I recently heard a podcast about what it took to pass the Violence Against Women Act. It used to be legal to hurt your spouse and to hurt your children. There was no legal recourse in those situations, but we have changed as a society. We have recognized that these laws weren't doing their job. They weren't guiding or protecting the most vulnerable people in our society. So we repealed some and we changed others because we want them to align with living in a just society. And this is what people like me who promote immigration reform, this is what we want. We're not advocating for people to break the law, but for us to examine our own laws and to reform them, to change them. It's also notable that this passage here was written by the Apostle Paul, and that he himself was executed by the state, and that he broke Roman laws when they came into conflict with his own faith. And in fact, many of his letters were written from prison. You've heard a lot of myths about immigration, so I want to talk a little bit about facts. So immigrants today are no different than the ones that came generations ago. We share the same need, and we share the same humanity. What has changed is the laws. Presently, for many people, there are no lines to get into to migrate lawfully. This leads to unlawful immigration, which leads to vulnerability and invisibility. I told some of you earlier that there was a decade of about 40 years, there was a period of time of about 40 years in US history when 98% of the people who came through Ellis Island were admitted. 98%, sometimes 5,000 people in one day. These were not the wealthy from their countries. It was the same. That's why we have that beautiful poem on the Statue of Liberty that says, "Give me your poor, your huddled masses." 55% of refugees to the US are Christians. And the chance of being killed in a terrorist attack committed by a refugee is 1 in 3.64 billion. In fact, there's no record of any refugee having perpetrated any such incident. We take more risks when we get on a plane or when we drive our cars than we do in welcoming refugees to our country. Undocumented immigrants pay taxes, $12 billion in taxes last year. In fact, most of them file with what's called an individual tax identification number. This is a number given to them by the IRS so they can pay their taxes. Most of them are not able, though, to file for a return. So many think tanks that study immigration have said that the average immigrant pays $80,000 more into the system than he or she ever receives back. Immigrants who are undocumented are not eligible for public benefits at all. There's no way, there's a perception out there that that's a possibility, but actually it isn't. Their US citizen children could, for example, receive a benefit, but undocumented immigrants themselves can't receive food stamps or any public benefits that you can think of. So it's very interesting to me that undocumented immigrants pay taxes that support our social institutions. So why do you think it is that our government has a conflicting response to immigration? There is one part, the IRS and the Social Security Administration, that accommodates payments from undocumented immigrants, while there's another part, the Department of Homeland Security, that says they shouldn't be present. This is a very conflicting response from our government. I was telling a class earlier that I was talking to, it's almost like there are two signs at the border, and one of them says, "Keep out," and the other one says, "Jobs available." Immigrants create jobs. They also fill in the holes in our labor market at the high and low end of the job scale. Almost all economists say that immigration, and particularly unlawful immigration, has benefited the US economy. They complement the work that US citizens do, and they also contribute as taxpayers. Immigrants bring strong family values. They learn English and they integrate into our communities. Immigrants are more likely to attend church on a weekly basis, and they're more likely to be married and less likely to get divorced. And they strive to learn English. If you have encountered someone who does not speak English, they are most likely a first-generation immigrant. Only 23% of first-generation immigrants learn English well. And this is because typically they migrated as adults, and when it's much harder to learn a second language, and they're working, so they don't have as much time to devote to learning the language. But 88% of second-generation immigrants speak English well. and 94% of third and later generations. In fact, by the third generation, most people no longer know the first language they brought from the old country. And immigrants have an excellent work ethic, and through their work, they support our social systems. Most immigrants to the US are in their prime working ages. We are 13% of the US population, but 16% of the workforce. 50% of biotechnology workers are immigrants, 40% of medical scientists, 28% of physicians and surgeons, 22% of nursing, psychiatric, and home health aides, and 15% of nurses. And most of our food comes from California's Central Valley. 70 to 75% of farm workers in California are unauthorized. 70 to 75%. When I'm in the grocery store sometimes in the produce aisle, I look around and think about all the immigrant labor all of that produce represents. And immigrants are good neighbors. Historically, as immigration rates increase, crime decreases. Now, this is not because immigrants are better people. There's actually 3 important reasons. One of them is, of course, the threat of deportation. We suffer more for criminal behavior, so hence we're less likely to break the law. There's also a healthy immigrant thesis. People in other countries are aware that coming to the United States will be hard. That it will mean a lot of difficult work and usually manual work. So they self-select for those willing to work. And of course, there's also been greater enforcement. So more interior enforcement is deporting unlawful immigrants. So in short, immigration is good for countries and their economies. But even if it weren't, God commands God's followers to welcome immigrants, to do justice for immigrants, and to love immigrants as we do ourselves. Now, often when I get to this point, people ask me, well, what is it exactly that we want when we say comprehensive immigration reform? Well, I want you to see that there's 3 things. And I think there are things that are very possible, very feasible, things that we can accomplish. We just need the will of our legislators to do it. One is we want to make it harder to immigrate or work illegally, secure the border, and create an enforceable workplace authorization system. One of the things that nobody talks about is the fact that immigrants are able to get jobs in the US. That means somebody is hiring them. Our own citizens are hiring them. Because right now, we allow employers to opt in or out of an authorization system for their workers. So we need to create, actually we have one, we just need to require every employer to follow it, an enforceable workplace authorization system. 2, make it easier to enter and work lawfully. Consider our labor needs. We have a lot of labor needs, and we have an aging population that's retiring. So what are the labor needs that we have in our country? And also, keep families together. The fact is, we care about our immigrant neighbors. They are people made in God's image. These are things we can take into consideration to make it easier to enter and work lawfully. And finally, 3, require those who are here unlawfully to earn legal status, to pay a penalty, to pass a background check, and to pay taxes. This is what people mean when they talk about comprehensive immigration reform. It's absolutely possible and feasible. We, the people, have to put pressure on our legislators so that they care about this. So, often people ask me how they can respond. What can you do personally? First thing that you can do is you can really examine your own views on immigration. This is really critical, to know what you think about this and to know how your faith informs that. I reached a place in my life, even though I was an immigrant, where I realized whatever church or social group I was in sort of shifted my views on different issues, including immigration, because I didn't really know what the Bible said. I didn't really know what I thought about it and how God spoke into it. So it's important to be informed and learn, what does my faith say? Because if that's where our values come from, then our faith needs to inform that. Another thing you can do is to read the Bible in community with immigrants. You know, I had eyes to see Ruth as an immigrant and to read that story from that lens because I myself am an immigrant. In fact, when I read the Bible, I always pick up on movement of people. I read the Bible from that social location because that's where I sit. In Baltimore, I attend an African-American Lutheran church. And reading the Bible with my African-American neighbors has been really transformative for me. I see things in the scriptures I never saw. I see how much Joseph is like Emmett Till, a vulnerable person in a foreign place who was abused and exploited. The fact is, we need other lenses to see the scriptures. Reading the scriptures from a position of power only is incomplete. So reading the Bible in community with others, people who are in vulnerable places, people who are in the margins, is critical. I'm not telling you that you have something to learn from them. I'm telling you that you have everything to learn from them. And finally, we need to advocate. And I don't just mean advocate at this level. I don't just mean advocate with our legislators. I mean also advocate personally, on a personal level, talking to our neighbors about this. We've been taught not to talk about things that might cause controversy. But we need to talk about these things. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And when we hear an immigrant neighbor being dehumanized by someone we know, it's important for us to have the courage to advocate in that moment, to speak up and say, hey, we can disagree on this issue, but we don't dehumanize image bearers of God. We don't speak about God's children that way. But let's talk about immigration. Tell me. Ask questions. Listen. But definitely have rules of engagement so that people don't say things about immigrants that are harmful and dehumanizing. Remembering is a big part of the scriptures. Over and over again, God tells his people, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Remember your God. Remember the words that God has given to you. So I want you to remember. I want you to remember Ruth, an immigrant woman, treated justly in a society where she could have suffered, where had things been differently, she could have been exploited, she could have been one of the most vulnerable people there. But instead, she is loved and she's welcomed by family, like she's family. Remember Ruth, and remember your immigrant neighbors. Amen. Thank you.
I'm Karen Salpi. She's Karen Gonzalez. I'm from the English department. She used to be an English teacher.
Yes.
But that's okay, we're going to talk about immigration. Would you quickly, without telling the stories, remind us of one or two more Bible stories that will help us shape our understanding of immigration?
Sure. Well, I think one, for example, is the story of Joseph, who at first was a victim, a survivor of human trafficking, but then made the choice to stay in Egypt, and he became an immigrant who was in fact loved and welcomed, right? As long as he was alive. and so was all of his family. We also have the story of Abraham. When we first meet Abraham, it says God asked him to migrate, and he does. The story of Jesus' own story includes migration. Jesus has to flee with his parents to Egypt, and in fact, the Eastern Orthodox Church in Egypt, the Coptic Church, they have shrines to where they believe the Holy Family stayed and found refuge in Egypt. So Jesus himself even is part of that story. We have the story of Hagar, the Syrophoenician woman. Paul was an immigrant. I mean, there are so much movement of people in the scriptures.
Could you talk about what the journey looks like for immigrants to come from a country like Guatemala?
Sure. Well, today it's very, very difficult. When I was talking with a class earlier, I was telling them that at the time that my family came in 1981, we waited about 3 years for our immigrant visa to become available. That was the wait back then because we had a family relationship that could sponsor us to be here. That same wait is now 16 years. So I just was imagining my family undocumented for 16 years. And it would have meant that when I got to be 18, I wouldn't have been able to go to college. I would have had to wait until we had documentation. So it's a very difficult process right now. And as you know, the northern triangle countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala are the ones that right now are suffering from terrible violence and especially from gang violence, often from deportees from Los Angeles, where they learn to be gangsters, into our countries. And so it is very, very difficult today. In fact, I have relatives who are professionals, who own homes and have children, who couldn't get a visitor visa to the US because it's, even for visitors from those countries right now, it is extremely difficult. Mm-hmm.
So a question related, I guess. Do you agree that the U.S. Border Patrol has to screen people to prevent M13 gang members and others who would do us harm from entering?
The Border Patrol is there to provide us a secure border. Yes, I believe they should protect us from gangs, they should protect us from drug trafficking and all of that. But the people that are at the border right now, we don't have an invading army of criminals at the southern border. I have been there. I know. What we have is a humanitarian crisis. We have poor people who are fleeing violence and conflict, women and children. That's who's at the border. And if you haven't been, I invite you to go. It's important to see with your own eyes what's happening at the border. You know, there are people who live along the borderlands on both sides, and they've lived there for generations. The border isn't an imaginary line, it's communities of people who have been living there and who now are seeing this conflict because of where they live face to face. I think it's important to allow those people to speak into that conflict as well, into what's happening in their communities. And I've seen communities in Mexico try to serve the migrants that are coming from Central America and try to provide services for them, understanding the crisis. So there is no invading army of criminals at the border, only poor migrants.
Some people argue on both sides that we need to emphasize first securing the borders, building the wall, and others that we need to put that funding and resources into providing more screening so that there's not a 16-year waiting period. Mm-hmm. If you had to make that decision, which direction would you go?
Well, I would say a lot of for much of the 20th century until the 70s, the border was very porous, which means that it was more like a gate and people went back and forth through it. And it was very normal. The way our border is with Canada, for example, is the way the southern border was too. And there was a lot of movement back and forth across that line. And we have become, as we have militarized that border with the rubber bullets and the fencing and the barbed wire, it's not become safer. It's counterintuitive, But having a border that's militarized actually creates the violence it's come to be known for. It doesn't prevent it. And so, yes, I believe we should have a secure border, but a lot of the resources we're putting into all of these measures could be put toward, for example, having more federal judges that are able to adjudicate cases, having more workers who are able to determine credible fear for people seeking asylum. Instead of investing in more walls and more things that divide, we should really invest in people resources that can really serve. More social workers, keeping families together, focusing on investing in monitors rather than detention centers, which are incredibly expensive to fund. So that's my perspective on that. But there's an excellent book called Violent Borders that I encourage you to read. And it's written by a professor of geography and whose specialization is borders. And I've learned so much about borders and how much of what we believe about them is actually wrong and doesn't keep us safer. And I guess I want to challenge you too that, as people who are followers of Jesus, we're called to trust in our God and to obey our God, and not to trust in walls and barbed wire and rubber bullets. We have to trust and believe our God, and the fact is these things don't keep us safer anyway, and they harm our neighbors.
There are various questions here about whether you agree that people with a criminal background should be deported or not admitted. Questions about whether we should only admit people who to some degree objectively can improve our country. What about the widows and the orphans who maybe can't help themselves, who are indeed vulnerable, and the criminals? And those are two different questions, but
sure. So on the issue of part of when I say we should allow people to earn legal status and pass a background check. So, if you had asked me before I ever worked at World Relief, what should we do about this? I would say definitely we should not allow anyone with any criminal record to earn legal status or to enter our country. Now, what I have seen working at World Relief is that there have been people who, when they were young, made mistakes, like maybe some of you have as well, and perhaps there was a charge that was nonviolent, and most of them are nonviolent, and yet they have to carry this forever. It's like you never finish paying your debt to society, because now it also means you're going to be deported and you're going to lose your family and everything that you know. And so I would like there to be, if a person was not convicted for a violent crime that harmed another human being, then I think that yes, that should be part of earning legal status, and that person should be able to stay. However, if there has been violent crime, I agree that a person who committed a violent crime who was in our country should not be allowed in or should be deported when the background checks are done. And actually, in the past, this is how enforcement was taking place. It was people who committed crimes who were then deported back to their countries. But some of the things that have happened to me are just, I tell a story in my book about a man who came to our clinic who actually was at a party, drank too much, decided to sleep in his car, and the car was off. He wasn't driving. He was sleeping, in fact, when the police woke him up. They knocked on his window, and they gave him a DUI because apparently in the state of Maryland, you can't sit in the driver's seat. If you're sitting in the driver's seat, even if the car is off, you can still get a DUI. So he got this driving under the influence ticket, he got arrested, and that event caused him to get deported. And I really don't think that that's justice. The man was trying to be a good neighbor by not driving drunk, and he was penalized for this and deported and separated from his family. I mean, it's like arresting the Good Samaritan for kidnapping. When he was just trying to serve a neighbor, So some of the ways that our enforcement works, and again, he didn't commit a violent crime. He was sitting in his car, and he still suffered as if he had been, a violent person who had harmed people. And so I do think we should look at people. The way that God treats us as individuals, we should look at people's unique stories and situations. How long ago did this happen? When the person was a juvenile? And now everything since then, they've changed their lives completely. So I think that should be taken into consideration. But I do agree, we should not allow people who were violent, for sure, to stay.
Your book emphasizes stories, individual stories, and as we've heard many times throughout the series, stories tend to be the information that move people. We also do need data and statistics, and some of the things that you mentioned in your presentation, I'm wondering if you can recommend one or two good resources for identifying statistics related to immigration.
Sure, yeah. There is actually an excellent book that is not Christian that came out last year called The Faraway Brothers. It was written by a journalist who actually followed two brothers from followed the story from the time of their lives that they lived in El Salvador all the way to they partially rode, different kinds of transport, all the way to Mexico and their migration, and even a few years into their lives here, and it's called The Faraway Brothers. It is a really excellent book that has both that story, and what I love about the story is it doesn't promote this myth of the good, perfect immigrant. We're just people. We can't be expected to be perfect. And so you see them in all their humanity, all their imperfections, all their flaws, but also you see so much of the good, so much of the gifts that they bring with them into their new country. And she shares a lot of data, a lot of statistics. It's very well done. Also, it's heartbreaking to read some of the things that they see and experience. No one, especially not children, but no one should get to see and experience. And so that's a really great book that I highly recommend. There are a number of good books. Welcoming the Stranger by Jenny Yang and Matt Sorens. They're my colleagues at World Relief. Their book is really good. Jenny is a policy expert who works on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, and she knows so much about this. A lot of their book, they just did an updated edition to update all the data. That's also a very good book, and it's from a Christian perspective. There's a lot of really good resources out there right now. Another friend of mine wrote a book called Love Undocumented, and it's about her marriage to a U.S. citizen and how she walked through the system with him of getting documented and just how she entered into loving her immigrant neighbors through that process. And it's a very powerful story, and also you'll learn a lot about our system. It's incredibly complex. It's very discretionary. I was telling people that I was so used to watching legal procedural shows on TV that I just thought immigration law was like that too, that immigration court was like that too, but it's not. It's extremely discretionary. The judge doesn't have to use law or precedent, nothing like that. It's just his or her decision about the case. And in the case that I told you about of the man who got the DUI, he had representation, he had an attorney, a very good attorney. She pleaded his case to the court. I thought for sure, with all the facts of this case, there's no way this man is going to get deported. But he did. I've seen other cases that were not even as good of a case as his, I thought, where the judge said, okay, and approved it. It's just, that's the way our immigration system works, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't know. And this is something that, Sara Quesada is her name. She invites people into this book to talk about. So there's a lot of good resources right now just to become more informed. And that's what I walked people in my book through my family's journey of immigration, because I wanted them to understand that and to understand some of the nuances. What I said about Ruth, that she wouldn't be allowed in, it's true. There's no recourse for so many people.
This is the point in the day where I always wish that I could just say, hey, let's stay 3 more hours, because there are so many more good questions. But I want to thank Howard Miller for underwriting today's presentation. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Karen, for speaking to us today.
Thank you.
We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you so much.